All right. Welcome all of our attendees and welcome our panelists today. I'm going to go ahead and spotlight myself there. Welcome to our webinar today. It's been a couple weeks since we did our last one. This is a kind of a busy time of year for everybody, so we're still trying to fit these in as we can. And the one we have scheduled today, I'm really excited for. This is a really important topic, and we've brought in a couple of heavy hitters, real experts in this field that I'm thrilled to be able to hear from. The topic for our webinar today is going to be trauma-informed practices to help foster student resilience. I will be your moderator. My name is Jason Johnson. I represent the WhyTry organization. And then I'm going to introduce our two panelists here in just a minute. Now, before I do that, I am going to make one request. We've been doing these since 2020. We've built up a really fun community built around these, and a lot of the kind of the great things that come from these webinars are discussions that take place in the chat. And so what I'm going to ask everybody to do, if you're willing, open up your chat tool and adjust your chat setting so that you're sharing your comments with everyone. If it says you're only sending your message to hosts and panelists, then only the three of us that are logged in as panelists can see your comments. And I think there's real value in the perspective that you all bring. And so if you're willing to make that adjustment, I think it helps the chat feel a little bit more like a community built around this topic, kind of intersecting with this topic as our experts share their insight on it. So if you're willing to make that adjustment in the chat, that would be awesome. Thank you. I think it'll help contribute positively to the discussion. And then with that, and without further ado, I am going to spotlight my two panelists here and introduce them, and then we're going to get into the discussion. We're going to shoot for going for about an hour today. This again is a very important topic, so we'll kind of play it by ear as far as the time goes and how the discussion goes. But let me introduce our panelists. First of all, we have Dr. Anissa Reilly. Dr. Reilly has been in education for over 30 years. For the last 15, she's been the principal of an elementary school in a large urban school district. Received her undergraduate from Morgan State, master's from Bank Street College, and her doctorate from the Sage College of Albany. She's the president and owner of Giant Step 6 LLC, available at giantstep6llc.com. She has written, wife, mother, author, and host of a YouTube show called the Ask Dr. Reilly Show. She does a little bit of everything. She's got upcoming books. First book soon to be released called 5 Buckets of Leadership. Another kid's book soon to be released called about an African-American female educational superhero named Dr. Action, soon to be released. And then her show is called the Ask Dr. Reilly Show, where she talks with individuals about trauma specifically. And that is put out through the OSG network that we've had previous guests from. I hope I have all my facts right on this. Anyway, thrilled to have you. Is there anything that you don't do, Dr. Reilly?
Yes, I don't build houses. I'm not a construction person, but yes, you have all the facts right. The book is out. So if you want to purchase the book or find any more information about it, it's in the chat. So thank you for having us, having me, and I look forward to our conversation.
Awesome. Thank you. You don't build houses, but you build communities, and that's just as important. All right. Next, we have Dr. Joseph Fenergrossi. Dr. Fenergrossi, graduate of the Warner School of Education at the University of Rochester, began his 26 years in education as a social studies teacher and has dedicated the last 19 years of his career as a building and district administrator, currently serving as the Director of Intervention and Professional Development for the Finger Lakes Community Schools. Coordinator of the Seneca County Community Schools, he's presented on the topics of trauma-informed instruction, community schools, and tiered intervention. Over 100 times is all. And in the last 5 years, including the PBIS National Conference in Chicago and the International APBS Conference, as well as consulted in over 30 districts. He was published in the Journal of Higher Education Theory and Practices in the fall of 2020. Dr. Fantigrossi, we're so grateful to have you and your expertise with us here as well today. Welcome.
Thanks, and thanks for having me. I'm glad to be here.
All right. So with that, for those that have been on before, you kind of have seen how we do this. I think we'll follow our traditional model where we'll do just kind of an around the horn model of questions. I'll throw questions out and let our panelists respond and hopefully lead the discussion in a direction that will be really beneficial to all of us that are on and participating. So the first thing that also, I guess I failed. I forgot to introduce myself formally. Jason Johnson, school psychologist, came from public ed. I represent the WhyTry organization. We're the organization that has hosted these webinars for the last year and a half. We're a social emotional learning and a resilience organization. We have curricula that leads out in those models. We're in over 23,000 different organizations throughout the country. So that's what I do. Now my job is to keep my panelists talking. So the first thing I wanted to hear is find out a little bit, if you could tell us just a little bit more about what your current role is and how an understanding of trauma impacts what you do. And I thought maybe we could start with Dr. Reilly and then go Dr. Fantigrossi.
Yes, thank you. So as you have already shared, I am currently a principal of an elementary school in New York City. And I've held that role. This January will make 16 years that I've been the principal of this particular elementary school. And my school is in the poorest congressional district in the nation. And so in addition to the effects that poverty have on students, we also experience a lot of trauma impacting events. We are in a crime-ridden neighborhood. We are in a neighborhood that is surrounded by project housing and tenements. And so when you put all of those together, you have a perfect storm for trauma induced children, trauma induced family life. And so as a leader, where I am leading a school where all of that is coming into the school building, it is imperative that I not only understand trauma, but ensure that our school is leading from a trauma-centered approach.
Awesome. Thank you. Dr. Fantigrossi.
Up until 7.5 years ago, I followed a pretty traditional path, a path that many educators would be familiar with. I was a high school social studies teacher, a building administrator, a district administrator, and received the opportunity to work for a federal education grant around intervention. And that intervention, the first grant was based in Wayne County, New York, which is between Rochester and Syracuse, a very rural area, a very beautiful area, but a rural area with the challenges of poverty and a lack of resources. And very quickly we found that in any work that we did, trauma was an underlying factor for some of the other challenges that our young people were facing. And so we have worked diligently over the last 7 years to get as much training out as possible, to bring as many resources as possible to the region. And I'm proud to say that we have moved the needle significantly according to our survey data. And we are currently managing about $10 million worth of grant funding to work towards trauma-informed care.
That's awesome. That's incredible. Thank you. So I wanted to go next. Trauma is a really big term. And I think a lot of people, I would expect, especially the ones that are in attendance today, definitely have a good broad understanding of it. But I know there's some particular details around trauma that I think are helpful to understand, especially as we consider how we are interacting with not only our students, but with one another. I was wondering if you could share any useful things, anything you can think of that would be helpful to understand about trauma and its impact that may not be commonly considered by educators and mental health professionals. Let's go first with, let's go Joe and then Anissa.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I would say that it's not understood, but I do think we start from the lens of empathy. And one of the things that Dr. Bruce Perry's work has really brought to light is that if we can change the way we look at troubling behavior, for example, from what's wrong with that person to what happened to that person to ultimately what's strong with that person, we really have made a huge leap in how we approach young people that we serve. The trauma research field has grown exponentially in the last 10 years. And because of that, there are a number of theories and ways to look at trauma. But the underlying factors, the underlying learning about trauma has not changed. And it is not a life sentence. Trauma is not something that is going to be a burden your whole life that you can't be successful with. It can be a challenge, and it is our challenge as educators to give students the necessary tools and support, and quite honestly, love to help them move forward and to become more resilient in the face of that trauma.
Thank you. I love that. You said, so it goes from what's wrong to what's happened to what's strong. Awesome model. Anissa.
Yes. And so what I think people don't know or don't place as much value on when it comes to trauma is relationships. And I think that is exactly what Joe was talking about going from what's wrong with that person to what happened. And it's in the what happened that you begin to build the relationship and begin to understand the person as a human, whether they are 7 years old, 16 years old, or 50 years old. You begin to understand their humanity. And when you think about the work, as Joe has just said, and how you approach it, you have to approach it from a relationship standpoint, because from that is where you get to see the person, and then you begin to understand their various experiences and understand the fact that what they've been through is what has caused them to be where they are today, behaving the way that they are or responding the way that they are, because all behavior is a form of communication and it is a result of something that has happened to all of us or individually.
Thank you. Love that. I'm always writing notes on this. I'm keeping notes on what I hear, because it always creates such a nice, I think, energy around the topic. So I was wondering if you could each address, I know you've done quite a bit of work, and I hope we can hear a little bit about some of the things that you've done specifically, particularly when we shift in just a minute over to some of the strategies that you've used that you think might be helpful. But I was wondering, before we jump into those, if you could just recommend, one of the hard things I think around the topic of trauma is that there's not necessarily like one model that everything centers around. There's a lot of different models. There's a lot of different approaches. What do you all recommend as far as how you would pursue? Like, do you approach looking for a specific type of model? Do you have certain guidelines you recommend following when you look into a trauma or a trauma-informed model? Give us some guidance on where to go, and then I want to hear a little bit more about what you've done. Let's go, Anissa, and then Joe.
Yes. So when we look at the various frameworks that are out there to help us with having a trauma-informed approach in our schools or period, it's all wrapped around the 5 standards that you can find, or competencies rather, that you can find in CASEL. So when you look up the CASEL standards, you'll see self-awareness, social responsibility, decision-making, et cetera, et cetera. So it's all built into those. And so when you are thinking about how you can approach trauma in your school or in your classroom or in your sphere of influence, you need to make sure that you are addressing those 5 in some form or capacity. And in that, when you are addressing them, part of what needs to occur is making sure that you're building in a sense of resilience. And the way in which you can do that to string it all together, when you're building resilience, you have to make sure that there are some pieces available or present in that. And it comes out of the work by Vicky Romero and some of her co-authors. And they talk about talking, trusting, repairing, and feeling. So if you talk, trust, feel, and repair. And so as you having those 4 pieces prevalent in whatever framework or whatever system you have in place, coupled with the Castle standards, then you have a nice platform for setting the stage for trauma practices in your school or sphere of influence.
Nice, thank you. Joe.
Yeah, I really like Anissa's focus on resilience, because that's really what we come down to. Is this is not necessarily a discussion of, oh, woe is me, our students have trauma. It's what are we going to do about it? What's our action steps? And so we started working from a platform called the ARC framework, Trauma and Learning Policy Institute. And then we furthered our work with Lesley University outside of Boston, Massachusetts, which they call it the ARCH. And I'm going to show you a quick graphic that brings that to light. And so we believe that if we can give young people skills in these 4 categories, and do that in collaboration with the community and families, that we will help them find their success. From left to right, ARCH, the collaboration ARCH, attachment, meaning we're teaching young people about relationships. We're teaching them that what it feels like to be part of a caring relationship or an organization or a community or neighborhood. Regulation really is self-regulation, but the S doesn't fit really well in the acronym, so we say regulation. Self-regulation of your emotions, and what do I do when I need to cope with those emotions? Competency, meaning I have skills, because when someone knows and is confident in the fact that they have skills, then they grow in their confidence, they grow in their self-efficacy, and they really are able to build stronger relationships and are more likely to regulate their own emotions because they believe in their self-worth. And health, we focus on the physical aspects of health because we believe the other 3 cover the mental aspects of health. But general health, but more importantly, are we covering the basics? Sleep, nutrition, housing, exercise. Are we covering those basics? And ultimately, we believe that that can only be accomplished not within just the 4 walls of the school building, but in a collaborative effort with families, with community agencies, with local and state and federal government agencies, to really give us a focus of how to teach resiliency.
Thank you. It just struck me. It's interesting in the professional model as educators. One of the terms that we often look to when we're pursuing things for our buildings is something that will build capacity for our educators. And it just struck me while you were both talking, we probably need to have kind of the same, I think, vision for our kids as well. Like, what can we do to build capacity for our kids, especially from a resilience standpoint? To build a person's capacity to be more resilient is really, really vital, and I think a useful lens to view that through. I was wondering, so you mentioned the action steps. Let's get into some of the action steps now. I was wondering if you could share some tips, strategies, any ideas that you have for educators, for our attendees now, that could assist them in working with their students in trauma. And if it helps when you share your tips or strategies, if it helps for you to share personal stories where you've seen them applied or used, please feel free to do that. I think the stories can really provide important context on that as well. Let's start with Anissa first, and then we'll go to Joe.
What I'm about to share probably may seem extremely simple in its approach, but it is extremely powerful in its implementation, because, just to give a little backstory, trauma interrupts your brain, and trauma leaves scars on your brain. There is proven brain science around it, and how you interrupt that, like Joe and I have said, is about building in resilience. And building in resilience is grounded in developing relationships. And so I shared the talk, listen, feel, talk, trust, feel, repair steps. And so when you're building relationships, the first thing that you do with students, whether they are, as I said before, 7 or 5 or 10 or 16, is to talk, and not just talk to them or talk at them, but really talking to listen so that they are heard, regardless of what it is that they're saying, regardless of how, how students can be very like, what are you talking about? Whatever it is that they're saying, you're just listening to them and let them be heard, because they may have a small language capacity or small vocabulary to explain how they're feeling. And as you are hearing them, honor the words that they're using, whether they're colorful words or not, honor that. And then you want to build trust. And the way that you build the trust is, as you are listening to them, you are honoring what they're saying. You are very clear with them about what's happening. You don't violate their trust. Whatever you are saying you're going to do, you're going to do. You're not going to embarrass them. If they're giving you information and they say to you, please don't tell anyone, you have to say it up front. I can't promise you that, because you may tell me something that I must report or must say. So you have to let them know that, versus, okay, tell me anything. You can trust me. And then you have to go and report it. And then you just broken trust, even though your intentions were really to do well or not to do them harm, but you've just violated trust. And then the second one is to feel. So you heard Joe say in the beginning about being empathetic. So really feeling what they are going through and letting them know that you understand. And then the final thing is repairing. So you may have some students who have been very outspoken and challenging in their behavior, or have big personalities where they have hijacked your classroom or hijacked the school, or have presented scenarios where it is very uncomfortable for you. But you are the adult, and you are the one that can repair the relationship. And you do that by instituting what I like to call warm demanders. That's a phrase that I got from one of my colleagues about using warm demanders. And what that basically means is you are very clear to the individual, to the student, about what it is that you want, with the understanding of what they're going through. So for example, we have children that come in that may say that they're extremely tired. They worked last night. There was a whole lot going on in their home. And as a result, they are not able to complete the work for today. So a warm demander statement would be, I understand that you have a lot going on, and I understand what you're going through. So perhaps You can take a 5-minute nap, but after this 5-minute nap, you must get up and you must complete the work. That is what is required for today. If they're hungry, I understand that you're hungry. I'm going to give you an apple. You eat this apple, but you are now required afterward to complete the work. And so as you are continually instituting these warm demanders, as you are repairing the relationship and you're feeling and you're thinking and you're building trust, then you're able to interrupt what trauma has done and build the resilience.
Awesome. Thank you. I want to make sure I have this right. So you have talk, trust, feel, repair.
Yeah.
And then in conjunction with that, you have what you describe as warm demanders. And I love that term. I would like to borrow it if that's all right with you.
Yes, I borrowed it, so you keep on borrowing.
It's really good. It's a really good description on how to kind of simultaneously empathize while still maintaining expectations. That's awesome. Joe.
I think one of the challenges is when we think about getting those supports and interventions in place, it feels overwhelming when we think about it student by student. So a lot of the work we do is associated with how do we create the right environment to be able to efficiently and effectively deliver those interventions in the appropriate dosage. And so a visual I'll show you is something that we use to organize our interventions. So we organize our interventions by tiers. And we have programs in tier 1 that we do with all students. So for example, Botvin's life skills. We recognized in reviewing survey data that there was a precipitous increase in drug use for students between 6th and 8th grade. So we got all 11 districts in our county to agree to offer this curriculum if we were able to find the funding to buy the curriculum and the workbooks. And so we partnered with our county mental health officials to make sure that every 6th grader in the entire county received that curriculum. So what are we doing for all students? And then there's always going to be a percentage of students, we estimate it to be at 15%, 1-5, that are going to need small group intervention. And there are some of the programs we use at the tier 2 or small group level. And then there are going to be students, 5% or so of our student population that's going to need intensive intervention. And one of the things we've been able to do is we co-locate mental health staff from the county mental health department right in our school buildings. And restorative practices is that foundation across all of the tiers. Because at tier 1, restorative practices looks like community circles. At tier 2, community practices looks like a small group conversation to discuss a troubling topic. At tier 3, restorative practices looks like harm repair. So we work really hard to establish systems so that we're not relying on just the excellence and work ethic of one person, because at least in our region, our turnover is relatively high. So we have to make sure that the system exists so that when someone new comes to fill that role, that they're not trying to reinvent the wheel every time, that they have some place to start and do good work from.
That's great, Joe. Somebody asked, what was YAP mentoring that you had listed there?
Yeah, YAP is actually a national mentoring organization. It stands for Youth Advocacy Program. And I'm so glad they asked about that, because I'll give you a 60-second anecdote about it. When we became aware of the Youth Advocacy Program was when we had several young people who were going through the judicial system. And as part of their consequences, they received a mentor. So we went to YAP and said, why don't we try to do that before they're involved in the judicial system? And so we started finding students who were showing tier 3 needs in our schools and asking the family if it was okay to give them a mentor right then and there. And so we use mentoring a great deal, and the YAP advocates are especially trained to work with high needs students who need that one-to-one relationship and support.
That's awesome. Thank you. I'm a personally and professionally, I'm a huge proponent for mentoring programs. And it struck me while you were both talking. I think in part, I've always liked them because they've felt like they were particularly effective to me. And it just struck me, my background before I came over to the WhyTry organization actually was around resilience as well. I ended up getting published on the topic of resilience, and all of the research lines up exactly with what you're describing as far as like the power of relationships and human connection goes towards a person being resilient. And it just kind of struck me. I think the dots just finally connected on maybe that's part of the real power in mentoring programs is it creates a really natural place for that connection and relationship to occur. And we know that for many individuals that a relationship becomes the birthplace for resilience. And so when it comes to trauma, that's really, really vital. So thank you. I did want to, I'm going to go off script just a little bit here. It struck me that it may be worth mentioning do either of you have either like a 60-second explanation or testimonial on restorative practices or restorative circles models? That's a term that some people may not be familiar with. Would either of you be willing to just give a brief description on what that is to make sure we're all on the same page? Because that's a very, very powerful model that I think can be really helpful.
Sure, I'll let you go.
Restorative practices came about, has been used for over a decade, but it was primarily used in juvenile justice settings. And then about a decade ago, they started using it in more traditional K-12 settings. The early research was promising, but it was pretty anecdotal and case study based. But over the last 10 years, they've done many studies regarding the power of it. And so it is a more accepted practice across the country. If I had to break it down quickly for you, I would say that restorative practices is a way of recognizing student voice. It's a way of valuing the human experience and valuing the fact that every person in the room has their own story, their own value, and their own way. And community circles, the tier 1 version of, if you will, of restorative practices, is an opportunity for a class or a small group of people to sit in a circle, and everyone has the chance to speak on either a prompt that's given to them by the facilitator, or a more open-ended response of, for example, how are you feeling today? There are many ways to do restorative practices. There's not one textbook of restorative practices, but there are some universal concepts that pretty much everybody who practices that agree upon. And during COVID, we as an organization actually put together a restorative practices toolkit that is free to anybody who would like to download it. It is on our website, which Mark has already posted, flxcommunityschools.org. And you'll see several toolkits there, and one of them is under restorative practices. I hope I did that justice, but Anissa, if you have something more, please.
I would just add that it also provides you with the language that you would probably need in order to engage in such conversations, because as educators, we're not therapists. And so we may not really know how to respond or what to say or the types of language that would be used that could be a trigger. And especially when you're in such sentimental settings and that could be touchy or charged with emotions. How do you move the conversation so that way it is exactly what it's supposed to be, restorative in nature and repairing relationships? And so that's what I would add. It helps you give the language. It helps you to know what to listen out for. It helps you to know how to make those pivots and shifts when the conversation may get too emotional or too charged. And so that way you can feel confident as an educator as you are facilitating the conversation. And then I would also say, if there are any administrators out there, it's a great way in order to bring your staff together as well. And so restorative practices are just not necessarily for classroom practice, but it also could be a school staff practice, especially now that we've been through the pandemic and people are coming back with some feelings and emotions and trauma that they may not have even realized is truly impacting who they are and how they're showing up.
That was awesome. Thank you. I'm just typing oh, there we go. Joe beat me to it. So there's a couple links there that you can access toolkits and some of the resources that Joe just mentioned and Anissa talked about. And I really, really appreciate Anissa. I think you brought up something that's really key through all of this as we discuss trauma and consider trauma. And I think it's one of the things that makes us kind of, I think, extra sometimes nervous about it, is it feels like it is this big thing that exists in a mental health space. And for most of our educators, in fact, don't have a background in mental health. And so I think it can feel really daunting and really overwhelming for how we can step into and kind of assist with this thing. And so anything that can give us language and good guidelines, and then also remember, kind of give ourselves self-grace that we aren't expecting everybody to be therapists or mental health professionals, but there's some base level best practices that really can assist. And you've addressed, I think, really, really effectively several of those. By the way, we're going to put up some links at the end with contact information for our panelists, as well as links to some of their resources so that you can get a hold of that. We're trying to keep them active in the chat, but if you've missed any of them, we'll put them back up at the end. Now, Anissa, you, I think, kind of got us going right in the direction I wanted to head with this as well, talking about trauma really broadly. You know, we think a lot about how it impacts our kids, but it's also impacted all of us. And the last year has really been interesting. First of all, pretty much all of us have experienced a collective traumatic event. You know, the isolation and loneliness that we all experienced during the pandemic, as well as the impact from an economic and a health standpoint. It's really impacted everybody. So we all have that shared experience. But I think the last year has really brought to surface a lot of existing trauma as well, that I think was always there under the surface for a lot of people, that has kind of crept out as well. So I want to pose the question to you. What advice do you have for adult staff in being supportive to one another through their own trauma, as we are, you know, all kind of working through our own things? How can we model this and be supportive to one another in a useful way that I think will not just impact our kiddos, but also impact us as adults? Let's go Joe and then Anissa.
I think the underlying piece is what kind of tools, what kind of support, what kind of training have we provided to the adults who work with our young people. We believe very strongly in creating a universal skill set. And one example I'll give you is mental health first aid. We came across mental health first aid probably about 7 or 8 years ago. and it is a course that is a one-day course that is meant to give basic skills to anybody who comes across someone who is having an emotional challenge. One of the phrases we really like to use is, you don't have to be a therapist to be therapeutic for somebody. And we don't want food service or custodians or others to be therapists. We're not asking them to do that. What we are asking is, can you support that young person? Can you care for them? Can you be empathetic towards their needs? And importantly, can you get them to those who are experts and who are trained to do that work? So we started providing mental health first aid, and the one that's specific for kids, youth mental health first aid, to all staff members in school districts. And what we found is we started creating common language. We started creating less fear for staff. I think one of the things that's really important to stress, and Anissa's done a nice job of this so far, is this I'm focusing on kids because I'm a career educator and I've spent my whole life in K-12. But the reality is this is a discussion for people. And one of the things that happens to many of us is when we don't feel well prepared for a situation, all of the trauma responses come to a head. So when you hear fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, and you think, well, that's a young person who's overwhelmed. Well, that could very easily be me who's overwhelmed. And I think we keep coming back to, how do we help people cope? And one of the things that we have found to be successful in helping people cope and helping people be stronger presence for the young people in our building has been, do they feel confident that I have a skill set to go back to? Do I have that training, that experience that I can say, I know that if I'm driving this bus and Jimmy gets on the bus and he appears overwhelmed, he's in tears, his face is sweating because he's so angry, that I know a couple of basic skills that I can help him regulate, and then I can notify the appropriate person to help him further down that path. And so we use mental health and youth mental health first aid. I'm sure there are other things out there for staff support, but that's one way we do it.
So mental health first aid. Let's see, I'm going to call out Mark, our good friend Mark. Mark, if you track down a link for that, throw it up in the chat. Anissa.
Yes. And so when we think about, how we as adults can show up in this space of trauma, especially when we think about trauma, there's like the big T and there's the little t, big T trauma, little t trauma. So big T trauma are like these world packed events, like big events, like the pandemic was a big T trauma event. It could have been a car accident. It could have been like 9/11 was a big T trauma. And then you have little T traumas, someone you were rejected, or someone said something to you and you had offense and it triggered something. So especially with big T trauma, sometimes we don't realize how much we were impacted by it, and with little T trauma. So as you already said, we didn't realize, some of us may not have realized how much trauma we were dealing with until we came into this pandemic. And so trauma, the effects of trauma are very discreet, right? Very discreet. You don't even realize that it has impacted you the way that it did until something prompted or triggered it. And you're like, wait a minute, why am I behaving this way? Or why am I responding this way? Or why am I doing like Joe said, I'm freezing, or I want to run, or I'm just withdrawn. And so when you think about that, it's important before you even show up in the relationship to assess your own capacity. What are you able to bring to the table? A friend of mine described people's hearts in this manner. She said there's some people that have a pint-sized heart, a gallon-sized heart, and some people have like a quart-sized heart. And they are only able to pour in love from that capacity. So if you only have a pint-sized heart, that's how much you can pour from. If you have a quart size, that's how much you can pour from. And if you have a gallon size, that's how much you can pour from. And know that about yourself. Know what you are able to bring to the table, and do not try to compare yourself to someone who has a gallon-sized heart, because that is what their capacity is. And so once you understand yourself and your capacity and what you can give, then you are able to show up authentically and provide genuine assistance to whomever you are engaged with, whether that is another adult or a child. And so you have to know that about yourself. And then if you say, you know what, yes, I have a pint-sized heart of love and I want to grow it because I want to do more, because I see that there is a need, then you need to get involved with practices and get around individuals, or get yourself involved in places and spaces where you could build your capacity, because your pint-sized heart may be a symptom or an outcome of trauma you've experienced, right? That you didn't even realize. And so, or your gallon-sized heart, some people say, I'm too nice, I'm always trusting, I'm always giving. And that may be a result of your trauma as well. And so it's just a matter of balancing that, because if you are aware of who you are, aware of how you show up, then you can help others. And so it's important that you do that, so that way you're not bleeding your trauma onto others.
That's awesome. Thank you. I think it might be appropriate. I'm going to put you back on the spot. And I've heard you talk before. You've referenced the wounded healer archetype as something that's important to how you've kind of approached things. Would you mind just talking briefly about what that is, what that means to you, and how that's been helpful for you?
Yes. So the way that I like to kind of lean into this archetype is a friend of mine that we were discussing the things that we have gone through. And once she heard my numerous stories of the traumatic experiences and events that my life has been filled with, she said, oh, Anissa, you've been tested with trouble. And I'm like, what? Who wants to be tested with trouble? Like, who wants, that's not a glorious like phrase or a glorious story. But she was like, no, you were tested with trouble. And I was just like, okay. So I held on to that and moved through life, continuing through life. And then I was talking to another friend of mine and began to think about, what can I do? How can I assist? How can I help? And as I was sharing a lot of the traumatic experiences and how I would like to use them, he said, oh, you're a wounded healer. And I'm like, what? A wounded healer? I've never heard that phrase before, didn't know what it meant. And he explained to me that the psychologist Carl Jung had created this archetype, the wounded healer. And basically what it is in a nutshell is that people, individuals who have been wounded, whether that's mentally, physically, spiritually, emotionally, have now found the strength to heal from their wounded place. Now, everyone can be a wounded healer, because sometimes the events are so traumatic that you are going to now re-traumatize the individual. But the wounded healer, a true wounded healer, can be in the place, in the space with the individual, in the trauma with the individual, and help them come out on the other side, because they have been triumphant and coming out on the other side. So it's being able to understand and relate, because you have experienced that, but you're now on the other side of it. As you heard Joe say, it's not a life sentence. You don't have to be there forever. Even though trauma doesn't go away, you know how to move through it, so that way you are not a walking zombie, or you're not a functional depressed person, but you are living a life that is healed and whole and you're helping others do the same.
That was awesome. Thank you. It reminds me in the WhyTry model of resilience, we have a source of resilience we call street resilience. That's specifically about it's when your identity has been challenged, or when you've been the recipient of some significant disrespect or discrimination, and when you have the capacity to take that and then channel that into being productive, that becomes a really, really vital source of resilience. And it can be a really effective way in dealing even with your own trauma. So, hey, I was wondering if you could give some advice. I suspect that there's some people on here today that are fully bought into what we've talked about, and they're very interested in wanting to do something. But they may not know where to start, or perhaps they may not feel like they have the buy-in around them that they need yet. What advice would you have? Because I think you've both done some pretty impressive implementations. What advice would you have for that one person that may feel like they're kind of alone in their school on this? Where could they start in their classroom or in their office towards being more in line with a trauma-informed model, or being more supportive for their kids who've gone through trauma? Let's go Anissa and then Joe.
Okay. So yes, it would be great if you were in a school where you had an administrator who was fully supportive of that, but that administrator, I would say give that administrator some grace, because he or she may not have the language, he or she may not have even attempted to deal or discuss their own trauma. And so it's bleeding into the school environment, right? And so as a teacher or a staff member in the school, I'm sure that there are other staff members who are feeling the same way that you are, and who want to do some of the great trauma-informed approach or care that you want to do. And so I would say get with those individuals in the school and really begin to talk, not talk about what's going on, but really engage in conversation about what you can do. Because when you're in your classroom, you can implement such practices that will move the needle in your room. And if you and the other staff members who have this same approach, that's 2 classrooms that are moving the needle. That's 3 classrooms that are moving the needle. And once you begin to have this movement, I guarantee you that administration will say, oh, what's going on in your classroom? Other colleagues of yours will ask you, well, why is your classroom different? Why are your students moving? Why is there such joy occurring in your classroom? And then you can begin to share it with your other colleagues. And it will impact the school. And then, as Malcolm Gladwell says, the tipping point will happen. So find your tribe, engage in conversation about how to implement versus complaining or talking about what's not right. But you know what you need to do. You're here on the webinar now getting some great tips and strategies that you can go back right away and implement.
Awesome. Thank you, Joe.
Yeah, I love that response. I always start from the base of self-care. It's really hard to do this work if you haven't come from a foundation of knowing how to take care of yourself. A book that I would recommend in that regard is Trauma Stewardship. Trauma Stewardship, Burke and Lipsky are the authors. Does a really nice job of explaining the importance of self-care for those in the service industry. The other tip, if you will, that I would give is if I were just starting this work and I worked in any educational setting, I would start with Susan Craig's work, C-R-A-I-G. Her most famous book is Reaching and Teaching Children Who Hurt. But she has several books, and it's accessible language and it's specific strategies. Finally, I would say, as Anissa said, it's about finding champions. There are people who want to do the work. And so I would recommend find your champions, feed off of their energy, team with them. I promise you, you're not alone. You might be a small group, but you can be a small but mighty group, and really work from there. And people start noticing. One of my colleagues says, when we write a grant, one of my colleagues says, they'll like us when we win. And so when people see success, they want to follow it. So I agree with her on that.
Can I just
love
add
that.
something?
Great advice. Yeah, please.
So some of the things that I talked about today came out of a book. It's called Building Resilience in Students Impacted by Adverse Childhood Experiences. It's a whole staff approach. And so if you get that book, just like Joe was giving some resources, it's easily accessible, and it'll give you the tools that you need to start small in your school, like Joe was just saying. So it's Building Resilience in Students Impacted by Adverse Childhood Experiences, a whole staff approach.
Awesome. Thank you. I'm putting up the slide. I'm going to ask one more question to carry us out, but I'm putting up the slide right now so that people can start writing down contact information, because we've shared a lot of information. And so if anybody needs to get a hold of our panelists, there's contact information to both them and their websites. What I wanted to finish up on, I was wondering if either of you would, or with both of you, would be willing to share a success that you're particularly proud of as it pertains to helping your schools or your communities address trauma, or share something that is giving you hope right now, or feel free to share both if you'd like. Let's go Joe and then Anissa, and then I think that'll carry us out right to the end.
There's quite a few things that we're proud of, but if I was sharing one thing, I would say the adaptability of our organization during COVID is something that I'm really proud of. We were an organization that came about with the concept of doing professional development work, supporting staff, making sure people had the right resources and tools to do the work. And we shifted very quickly to do support, direct support for families. We got involved in food distribution. We got involved in health clinics. We really shifted our model, our more traditional community schools model, into a direct service model to make sure that we were meeting the needs of our families. And I'm proud of that work. And I think I would want everybody on the call to understand that both of those things are important. Direct service is really important, and planning and structure is important as well. They each have their own time and their own place.
Thank you. Anissa.
Yes. So what I'm really proud about is prior to the pandemic, we would always talk about how much of a family we were at our school. We had strong professional learning communities. We were just moving together as one. And there were moments where I was, saw some areas that we could tighten up. But for the most part, I was like, okay. But once the pandemic hit, it really demonstrated that what we believed about ourselves as a school community was really true, because when you think about, pressure really determines what's inside of you, right? Pressure, think about a bug. When you squeeze a bug, that's what's going to come out. So when the pandemic came, it really challenged our structures, our systems, and our relationships at our school. And I'm just proud to say that we were able to stay as a community. All of my staff just talked about us providing the spaces that we gave them to talk, so that they were able to show up for the kids. One of the agreements that I had with our staff was, you focus on teaching and learning, and let me as the administrator worry about the rest. right? And that agreement stayed true and held through. And now we're back in the building, and I'm just proud that our staff was able to stay focused and understanding what we needed to do despite what was happening around us. And that came from a lot of the trauma work that I did personally on myself, and also infused in our daily practices as a school community.
That's awesome. Thank you. I think one of the things that is giving me hope, and I do think it's a success as well, is going through this pandemic has really forced, we talk about professional learning communities and the importance of collaboration, but we've realized we really do need to band together. And I've seen communities really expand, especially within education. And I've seen a lot of those lines that traditionally are pretty distinct start to get blurred, where we have education communities working with mental health communities, working with other community services, and even trying to work closer with families as well. And I think that's been really, really impressive to me. And I hope it's something that we continue to try to build on. And that's been one of the fun things about doing these webinars as well, is really building out that community, and to see so many people continue to show up, just really, really hungry to be part of this community, and really, really hungry to learn anything they can to really try to help serve these kids, because it's incredible humans that get into this industry, the service industry. It's not easy, but the people here continue to inspire me. I want to throw it out to you for parting thoughts before we wrap up, and also give you one last chance to plug wherever you would like people to find you, track you down. I know some of you have some books that we would love for people to check out as well, because you're really important voices on these topics. Dr. Reilly, tell people how to find you. We'll go with you first, and then we'll go over to Dr. Fantigrossi.
Yeah, so you can find me on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Ask Dr. Reilly. So you can just plug that in. As you see, my contact information is here. I also have written a book. I'm author of a book that teaches you how to be prepared to speak in any type of pressured situation. We know that our brain starts to go haywire sometimes when we have pressure coming at us, but I teach you a simple technique so that way you can have public speaking opportunities and sound like a pro. My talk show that was talked about at the top of our conversation is about real people that have gone through traumatic experiences but are triumphant. So the tagline is Triumph in Trauma. So if you are interested in learning about how to be triumphant, you can follow the YouTube show. It's in the chat, YouTube at X Dr. Reilly. And then part of my self-care is being around my tribe off school grounds. And so it is a coalition of principals across the globe, school leaders, politicians, musicians that are coming together to change the narrative for our marginalized children. So you can find that as well. And we meet weekly. So thank you.
You bet. Off school grounds is the real deal. It is. We feel so fortunate to be able to have a relationship with that organization, and are continually impressed by the work that you do. So thank you. You always represent well. Dr. Fantigrossi, how can people find you?
Email address and a website are on the screen. We also have active Twitter accounts. Our organization Twitter is at FLX Schools. My personal Twitter is at Fantigrossi. I also have a Facebook business page, Joseph Fenergrossi. A couple other quick things I'll mention. Please do not hesitate to reach out. I know that that's a common thing to say, but the people on the webinar think, well, I don't want to bother them. I don't want, I'll speak for myself in telling you that this is my life's blood. I will go anywhere at any time if I can to do this work. So in any of those ways, whether it be through Twitter or through the website or through the email address, I am glad and happy to have any level of conversation with you regarding this work. I'll also mention to you that one of the organizations that I'm part of is APBS, the Association for Positive Behavior Supports. That's an international organization around tiered intervention. And if you are part of that, I am currently nominated to be on the board of directors there. So if you could kindly consider supporting me for that, that would be great. I really appreciate the time today. And this is both a professional and personal passion. And I myself am a survivor of significant childhood trauma. And I was fortunate enough to have people around me who supported me on that journey. And so any chance I get to support others who are willing to give their life and their career to helping young people make that journey, I'm all in. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Oh my goodness, I've got the hair on my arms standing up after hearing both you speak so passionately on this. Huge thank you to everybody involved. Huge thank you to our panelists. Huge thank you to our attendees. This was recorded. If you want to share this or review it, it'll be up on our YouTube page probably within the next 2 days. If you want to reach out to the WhyTry organization, we've got an email address there. Or if you're interested in taking a look at our curriculum, you can scan that QR code, type that in. We'll give you access to our book, the audio and the e-version of our book, which outlines our resilience model. Really, really useful model if you want to come take a look at us that way. Otherwise, thank you all. It's so fun to be back together today, have our attendees coming in from all over the country to be part of this discussion. Love the passion that our panelists always bring, and just sincere thank you to all. You all, love you all, appreciate everything that you're doing. And look forward to getting back together again on whatever our next topic is. Thanks, everybody. I'm going to play